She was 11 weeks in. Nobody looked at her twice. The charge nurse had been direct.
Room 12 is restricted. Vitals, log, leave.
She logged, she left. Then she opened a drawer that should have been locked and read a record she had no clearance to touch. The dosage was wrong, not slightly, wrong in a way someone had chosen deliberately. She wrote one line in a journal nobody knew she kept and went back to work. On the third morning, the intake scan had vanished from every active chart. Not filed, not pending, gone. She had no authority, no access, and no one watching her back. What she had was a hand signal her father taught her at a kitchen table when she was 12. He was a special operations corpsman. He said, "Use this if the chain ever breaks." She walked into that press appearance. Nay adjusted the Admiral's IV line with steady hands and raised her hand for less than 1 second. The Admiral's eyes went still. He had recognized it, and the woman running that hospital had no idea what she had just allowed into that room.
From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story pulled you in, subscribe now. Because what comes next is the moment the Admiral walks into that boardroom and the CEO realizes a signal was never just a gesture. It was a chain of command she never knew existed.
It was a chain of command she never knew existed. The helicopter came at 5:14 in the morning. It passed low through the cloud cover above the city, rotors cutting the pre-dawn air with a sound that most people would have filed away as background noise and forgotten before they were fully awake. The city was still dark. The streets below Cresthaven Memorial Hospital held the particular stillness of an hour that belongs to no one, too late for the night and too early for the day, and the sound of the blades moved through the gray and was gone before it had properly arrived. Most people would not have moved. The woman on the rooftop access stairwell moved before she understood why. Her hands found the steel railing with a grip that had nothing casual in it. Thumb locked underneath the bar, knuckles adjusting to the cold metal, her body already turning toward the sound, a full beat before her conscious mind could have processed what it was responding to. She stood like that for 3 seconds. Body oriented north, chin lifted, eyes tracking the cloud line where the sound had entered and the cloud line where it had gone. And then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision rather than completing an action, she released the rail. Her hands opened. She let them hang at her sides. She watched the empty sky for a moment longer. Her jaw was set in the way that a jaw sets when a person is managing something they have no intention of discussing. Her eyes tracked the last edge of cloud without blinking for a beat longer than was entirely natural, and then she looked down at the city below with the expression of someone doing an inventory rather than admiring a view. She was 26 years old. She stood at medium height in scrubs that were slightly too large, worn underneath a navy zip pullover, with the collar folded down to cover something at her collarbone. There was a faint scar at the base of her jaw, pale against pale skin. Not the kind of scar that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. In her left hand she held a thermos, olive drab, military surplus, scratched at the base in a pattern that was not random but was too small to read in this light. She took one breath through her nose, controlled, deliberate. The kind of breath that has been practiced so many times it has stopped feeling like practice and started feeling like architecture. Then she checked her watch. It was an analog field watch with a scratched crystal face and a leather strap repaired at the wear point with a strip of black medical tape. The kind of watch you bought because it was accurate and legible in low light and had been designed for environments that destroyed ordinary things. She noted the time with the efficiency of someone for whom time notation is a reflex. I turned from the railing and descended the stairwell with the quiet, heel-to-toe precision of someone who had been taught at some point and in some context that the goal of moving through a space was to move through it without being heard. Her name was Isolde Vane. She was 11 weeks into her first rotation in the ICU at Cresthaven Memorial, and not one person in the building knew what that meant. The locker room was empty at 5:31 a.m., and it was empty because she had arranged it that way. 11 minutes, every morning the same 11 minutes. She arrived before the first overlap of night shift and day shift, before the brief corridor congestion of nurses exchanging information and administrators beginning their early rounds, before anyone who might ask a question or offer a well-meaning orientation comment. She used the 11 minutes the way a person uses a room with a locked door, to be exactly herself, without the particular effort of being something slightly different. She moved to her locker and worked the combination with the speed of a person who has entered the same sequence so many times that the hands know it before the mind does. The locker opened with its standard institutional sound, metal on metal, and she stood for a moment in front of it. Everything inside was organized in a way that was correct, but not quite standard. Her uniform items were folded in thirds, not halves. It was a small difference, almost invisible, the kind of thing that registered as a mild anomaly without explaining itself. The fold was precise, and each corner meeting its opposite with the exactness of someone for whom the fold itself was not vanity, but habit. An old habit, deeply grooved from a context that had nothing to do with hospital laundry. At the top of the locker, secured in the back corner, a small metal tin, no larger than a playing card case, with a combination lock of its own attached to a short length of cable. She did not open it. She reached in and touched it, one pass of her thumb across the lid, light and deliberate, and then withdrew her hand and reached for her uniform. She changed with the locker door positioned between herself and the room's mirror. She did not look at her own reflection. This was not vanity in reverse. It was the practiced indifference of someone who had decided, at some point, that their own face was not information they needed in the morning. Below the tin, pressed flat against the back wall of the locker, a photograph lay face down. She did not look at it either, but her awareness of its position was visible in the particular care she took, not to disturb the items near it. She sat on the bench with her field journal across her knees. It was a small, hardbound notebook, with a sewn binding and a cover worn pale at the corners from handling. The pages inside were block printed, every entry beginning with a time stamp, the handwriting the kind that contains no ambiguity. Each letter formed completely and separately. No connecting loops, no shortcuts, no room for misreading under poor conditions. The margins held small notations in a secondary hand that was even more compressed. The kind of annotations made in the moment rather than in reflection. She reviewed her patient assignments. She moved through the list with the efficiency of someone building a spatial map from data. Not just reading names, but constructing a ward in her mind, a route, a sequence of needs ranked by priority rather than room number. When she reached the last name on the list, a new addition entered into the system overnight. Her pen stopped. She read the name once, then she read it again. The pen did not move. For a full 3 seconds, which was a long time for a person whose baseline pace was several degrees faster than the average of the people around her, the pen held its position above the page, and Isolde Vane held her breath in the measured way of someone who has received information and is choosing how to file it. She wrote nothing beside the name. She closed the notebook. Crest Haven Memorial was the kind of hospital that understood that environment was a form of argument. The ICU reception area had fresh orchids, real ones, not silk, the kind that communicated something about institutional priorities through the simple fact of their maintenance cost and their tendency to wilt. The corridor walls held original art, purchased rather than printed. The nurses' station had been designed with enough space that it communicated competence without overcrowding, and the lighting had been calibrated to produce alertness rather than fatigue. Isolde walked in at exactly 6 a.m., and her eyes made their first circuit of the room, the way eyes make a circuit when they have been trained to gather information, rather than simply receive it. The orchids registered as real and recently changed. The art registered as local. A deliberate purchasing decision signaling community investment. The corridor registered as clean, adequately lit, and equipped with a hand sanitizer dispenser 6 inches to the right of the orchid arrangement that had not been refilled in, based on the dried residue ring at its base, approximately 1 week. She crossed to the supply cabinet. She did not ask where it was. She found it on the second door she tried, located the refill bottles, and refilled the dispenser in under 90 seconds. She replaced the bottle, closed the cabinet, and returned to the nursing station without drawing attention to the fact that she had noticed a problem and solved it before anyone else had finished settling into their morning. Ren Aldgate arrived at 6:08 a.m. and conducted the particular evaluation that charge nurses develop after years of managing new staff. A glance that was efficient enough to function as a full assessment. Ren was in her mid-40s, with the specific tiredness of someone who had managed too many rotations of too many rookies, and had learned that trust was a conclusion reached after evidence, not before it. She took in the slightly oversized scrubs, the field watch, the absence of the decorative lanyard clips and personalized badge accessories that most first-year nurses accumulated within their first month. She took in the hands, nails filed short and flat, no rings, no adornment of any kind on the left wrist below the watch, and something at the right wrist that was partially covered by the scrub sleeve. And she assigned Isolde rooms 7 through 11 with the efficiency of a decision already made. Isolde confirmed the assignment with one nod. It was not the nod of a person accepting a diminishment. It was the nod of a person recording received information, acknowledgement without comment. And she moved directly to begin her rounds without the brief hesitation that most new nurses showed when first released into a ward they hadn't yet fully mapped. Room 7. A post-thoracic patient 3 days out from surgery. Vitals stable, drainage output within expected range. She completed the assessment in the time it should have taken to complete half, using a palpation sequence along the thoracic margin that was thorough, deliberate, and not part of the standard first-year nursing rotation protocol. It was precise in the way that things are precise when they come from repetition rather than from instruction. Room 8, a cardiac monitoring patient, 58, whose chart indicated routine observation. Isolde read the chart in the time most nurses spent orienting to the room, and then checked his peripheral pulse at 3 separate points, radial, brachial, and a third point at the base of his palm that the chart did not indicate checking, but that provided information the other 2 points did not. Room 9 held a man in his 70s named Gerald, whose heart had failed him 6 days ago, and who had not yet decided how he felt about being alive on the other side of it. He was awake when Isolde entered, staring at the ceiling with the particular attention of someone who has recently been given a reason to take sealing seriously. Though she worked through his assessment without excess conversation, which Gerald appeared to appreciate. She checked his pedal pulse, his capillary refill, the IV site at his left forearm for infiltration, and then moved to percussion along his lower lung fields with 2 fingers, tapping in a sequence and listening to the resonance with her head angled slightly to the side, her eyes unfocused in the way of someone hearing rather than seeing. Gerald turned his head and watched her. "You've done this before," he said. She looked up. The small, practiced smile appeared, the kind that answered without answering, warm enough to be genuine and contained enough to offer nothing. "First rotation," she said. "That's not what I said." She finished her documentation and moved to the door. Gerald continued to watch her, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent enough years around competence under pressure to recognize it when it appears in an unexpected context. Room 10 and room 11 she completed with the same quiet efficiency, and then she was at the end of the assigned corridor. And at the end of the assigned corridor was the door she had not been assigned. Room 12, the badge access panel where the standard key lock should have been. The blackout panel over the observation window, installed with the kind of permanence that suggested it had been placed there by someone with authority rather than someone improvising privacy. No patient name, no dietary board, no whiteboard with the rotating nursing staff information that every other room in the ward displayed. Isolde's pace changed as she approached it on her first pass. Half a beat slower, a fraction of a second's reduction in speed that was almost invisible, and then corrected immediately, her pace re-accelerating, as if catching itself. Her head did not turn toward the door, but the angle of her attention shifted, and in that shift she gathered what she needed. The badge reader model, the door seal type, the fact that the blackout panel had been mounted from inside the room rather than outside, which meant whoever installed it had access to the room, which meant they were not facilities staff responding to a patient request, but someone who had been inside before the patient arrived. She noted all of this without slowing. She continued to the nursing station and began her documentation. She said nothing about room 12 to anyone. All on the other side of the hospital, in an office whose single glass wall overlooked the central atrium with the specificity of a designed vantage point, Lavinia Price was already in her 3rd meeting of the morning. She moved through Cresthaven Memorial the way a current moves through water, not with visible force, but with the property of shaping everything it contacts. She was 52, silver-haired, dressed in charcoal with a single strand of pearls that were not decorative in the way that jewelry is typically decorative. They centered her in a space the way a level centers a frame, a structural element wearing the costume of an accessory. Her office had been designed to communicate. The glass wall facing the atrium meant that she could see the hospital from above, which also meant the hospital could see her in her office. Which also meant that her visible industry communicated something about institutional vigilance to everyone who passed below. The art on her interior wall, the wall not visible from the atrium, was a single large framed architectural rendering of a proposed expansion wing, the dimensions and the nameplate at its base reading in bold print that only the people in her office would ever see. She was on her second call of the morning when her assistant placed a folder on her desk and withdrew. She picked it up without breaking her sentence and opened it with one hand. Inside, a single sheet. A room assignment update. A name. She glanced at it, completed her sentence, and set the folder aside. She finished the call, opened her desk drawer, removed a second folder, heavier, older, the kind that had been handled many times, and placed it on the desk in front of her. She opened it. Inside, a flagged imaging report, a dosage authorization memo, and a handwritten note in her own script, with a date from 2 weeks ago, and 3 lines of text that she read, and then closed the folder over. She locked it back in the drawer. She stood at her glass wall and looked down at the atrium below, at the staff moving through it in their institutional patterns, at the corridor that led to the ICU wing, and at the specific section of that corridor, where, at the far end, a door that was not like the other doors sat sealed and dark. She picked up her desk phone. Has the management protocol for room 12 been adjusted per the revised timeline? She listened. Then do it this morning, and make sure the imaging review remains in the pending queue, not active, pending. She listened again. I'm aware. Keep it there. She replaced the phone. She looked at the rendering on her wall, the expansion wing, the federal funding relationship it depended on, the timeline that depended on a specific narrative about what Cresthaven Memorial was and what it was capable of. She had been building toward this for 2 years. She was not going to let a scheduling anomaly or a procedural complication interrupt it at the moment of maximum leverage. She went back to her desk and opened her morning agenda. It was on Isolde's 3rd morning that the drawer was left unlocked. She was restocking the medication cart for rooms 10 through 14 at 6:22 a.m. Working through the supply checklist with the compressed efficiency that had by now become her visible signature on the ward, the feature of her work that other staff noticed and responded to with varying degrees of unease, the way that a new team member who is faster than everyone else tends to produce not admiration, but a particular self-conscious discomfort in those who had previously set the standard. She was halfway through the cart when she reached the lower drawer. The lower drawer had a lock. The lock was not engaged. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, not with visible reaction, but with a particular quality of stillness that registered in the tendons of her forearm and the slight redistribution of her weight toward the balls of her feet. She looked at the drawer for 1 second. Then she looked both ways down the corridor. Empty. She opened the drawer. Inside, a medication administration log. The header identified it as belonging to room 12. She had no clearance to access room 12's records. She understood this. She read the log anyway, moving through the entries with the speed of someone who processes this kind of information faster than the reading speed model would predict, her eyes going left to right, and then returning without pause to a single line midway down the 2nd page. She read that line twice, the dosage figure, the timestamp. The authorization field, which was not blank would have been a clearer problem, but filled in with a credential that, on its surface, looked correct and beneath the surface. Did not match the attending rotation schedule she had memorized on her first day, because she had memorized it the way she memorized everything, automatically, completely, and without being asked. The tendon at her forearm tightened against the drawer edge. It was the only visible indication of what the information was doing. She replaced the log exactly as she had found it. She aligned its corner with the faint rectangular impression left by repeated placement, so that it sat in the drawer with the specificity of a thing undisturbed. She closed the drawer. She returned to her cart. She did not report it immediately. She did not ask questions. She pulled her field journal from her jacket pocket and wrote 1 line in block print. Day 3. Dosage variance, undocumented. She added a timestamp, turned the journal face down on the cart surface. And continued restocking. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Room 12. A man stepped into the corridor. Dark suit, no lanyard, no badge clip, no identifier of any kind that would have explained his relationship to the building. He was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with the posture of someone who had spent time in institutional environments where posture communicated rank even when rank wasn't being displayed. He looked left, then right, with the specific efficiency of a corridor check rather than a casual orientation. Both directions, quick, deliberate, gathering information about who was present and what they were doing. His gaze moved across Isolde. She was looking at her cart. He moved away down the corridor toward the administrative wing, his footsteps measured and unhurried, and he did not look back. Now Isolde did not watch him go. Her thumb had found the inside edge of her watch band and pressed lightly against the worn leather there, and she held the pressure until the sound of his footsteps had cleared the corridor completely. Then she picked up her checklist. She completed the cart in 4 minutes and 30 seconds and moved to begin her second round of patient observations. That afternoon, she found Dr. Holloway in the physician's alcove off the main ICU corridor. He was charting, which he did with the quiet concentration of a man who believed that documentation was not an administrative burden, but the last reliable record of what had actually happened in a room. She stood at the entrance without speaking until he looked up. "I had access to a medication log for room 12 this morning," she said. The lower drawer on the resupply cart was left unsecured. Holloway set down his pen. "I read the log before I replaced it," she continued without inflection. "The primary pain management dosage shows an elevation on days 2 and 4 that has no attending authorization in the record. The credential in the authorization field doesn't match the attending rotation for those dates." Holloway looked at her with the particular focus of a man recalibrating an assessment. "You know the attending rotation," he said. "I reviewed it on orientation day." "And you retained it." She held his gaze without answering, which was itself an answer. Holloway was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen and turned it in his fingers once, which was the only visible indication of what he was doing with the information. "Your room 12 has a restricted access protocol attached to it from above the attending level," he said. "You understand that?" "I understand it. The dosage variance doesn't change because of the access protocol." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He looked at the wall. Then he picked up his chart. "I'll review the management protocol," he said. She returned to her rounds. She did not check whether he followed through. She had delivered the information to the correct point in the chain, and had done it without speculation, without accusation, and without the kind of urgent framing that would have made the information harder for the receiving party to act on cleanly. She had simply stated what she had observed and let the observation carry its own weight. That was how her father had taught her to do it. She finished her shift at 6:52 p.m. And ate dinner alone in the break room, at a table in the corner that had a clear sightline to the door and a wall at her back. She ate with her field journal open and her pen moving in short, precise entries. She did not look at her phone. She did not listen to anything through earphones. She sat in the specific way of someone who is quiet because they are thinking, not because they are passive. She was building a picture. Over the next 2 days, it accumulated. She documented a post-operative scan ordered at intake that appeared in the initial chart record and then ceased to appear in any subsequent documentation, as if it had been ordered, completed, and then quietly removed from the active review sequence. She documented visitor log gaps on 3 consecutive nights. Room 12 accessed between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., a badge number logged, no name attached to the badge number in the public directory she had access to. She documented a medication timing pattern that she recognized, not from nursing school, not from any textbook she had been assigned in her training, but from a different source, a context she did not write in the journal because some knowledge does not belong on paper. On the 5th morning, Wren Aldgate found her at the supply station before rounds. "You've put in 2 chart access requests for room 12 in 3 days, Wren said, her voice carrying the particular quiet of a conversation that was not meant to be overheard. "The system is kicking them back. I was cross-referencing medication protocols against what I observed on secondary rounds," Isolde said. "You're on primary care for rooms 7 through 11. Secondary observation on 12 is a limited function. Vitals. Log. Leave. The vitals I'm logging include patterns that suggest the management protocol may not be fully documented." Wren looked at her for a long moment. The evaluation happening behind Wren's eyes was complex. She had managed enough rotations to know what a troublemaker looked like and what a genuinely attentive nurse looked like, and the two sometimes occupied the same person, which was the most difficult category to manage because it produced the most friction and the most value simultaneously. Isolde Vane was 11 weeks in, had filed 2 access requests for a restricted patient room without being assigned to that patient, had documented observations beyond her assigned scope, and did all of it with the calm, precise, that non-reactive energy of someone who was not testing a boundary so much as operating according to a different map of where the boundary was. "This room has instructions attached to it that come from above my level," Wren said. "I don't know the full shape of what's in there, and neither do you. Whatever you think you're seeing, be very careful about how far you take it." She held Isolde's gaze for one more second, then turned and went back to the station. Isolde stood at the supply cabinet and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. The fluorescent light above her hummed at its standard frequency. From somewhere down the corridor, a monitoring alarm sounded briefly and then resolved itself. The building moved around her in its ordinary rhythms. She looked confirmed, not alarmed. That evening in the empty locker room, she sat on the bench and held the metal tin in both hands without opening it. It was the gesture of someone handling an object that belongs to an absence, the particular weight of a thing whose original owner is no longer present to claim it. She held it the way you hold something you inherited rather than chose. Then she opened it. Inside, a folded photograph, worn at the edges, face down. A small laminated card with text in a condensed font. The kind of text that has been compressed to fit a specific amount of information into a space that does not accommodate excess. A length of paracord tied in a knot that had a name she had been taught and had never said aloud in anyone's company. She took out the laminated card. She read it. Her lips moved over one line, barely visible. The way lips move over words so familiar, they are almost sound rather than language. She had read this card many times. Tonight she read it with a purpose that was different from the purposes she had brought to it before. She closed the tin and set it on her knee. She opened her field journal to a blank page. She drew a diagram. Not text, not notation. A diagram of a hand position. 2 fingers extended upward from a closed fist. The second finger folded across the first at the knuckle, the thumb crossed underneath and pressed against the palm. She drew it with the specificity of someone working from memory rather than reference, getting the angles right on the second attempt rather than the first, correcting the thumb placement and studying the result. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to the photograph on the back of the locker wall and did not take it out or turn it over, only touched the edge of its lower corner very briefly, and then closed the locker and went to change. On the back of the photograph, the side facing outward, the only side visible without removing it, a handwriting in faded pencil said, "For when the chain breaks." The initials below it were CV. The next morning, the memo circulated to selected nursing staff before 7 a.m. Controlled press appearance, room 12, patient, 2 days from now. Selected personnel only. Full protocol briefing the following morning. Isolde received the memo at 7:14. She was not on the selected personnel list. She read it through once, folded it into her jacket pocket, and went directly to find Wren. "But who was assigned to the IV line check during the appearance?" she said. Wren looked up from a chart. "That detail hasn't been finalized yet," Wren said. "The patient in room 12 has a 20-gauge peripheral in the right antecubital. Based on the swelling pattern I observed during secondary observation on day 4, there has been microinfiltration at least twice in the past week. If he is moved to an upright position for an extended press appearance, that line needs a pressure check immediately before the appearance begins, and at intervals during it. Whoever is assigned to the detail without his patient history will not know to look for it." Wren set the chart down. "How did you observe a swelling pattern on day 4? Wren said. "Secondary observation is vitals and log." "I was in the room. I was thorough." "Thorough means you did what was assigned. Thorough means I noticed what was in front of me." Isolde's voice held the same level, factual tone it always held, without edge and without apology. "If I hadn't noticed it, and his line failed during a press appearance in front of cameras, we would be having a different conversation and it would be harder." Wren studied her face for several seconds. She picked up the phone. The conversation she had with Dr. Holloway lasted 4 minutes. Isolde stood at a chart rack 6 feet away and did not appear to listen. She was reading a patient's potassium trend across 3 days, her pen making small notations in her field journal. Wren set the phone down. Dr. Holloway wants to review your secondary observation notes on room 12, she said. His office. At 8 o'clock. Isolde closed her journal and went. Holloway had printed the log entries she had submitted through the standard nursing record system. The observations she had made during secondary rounds on room 12, documented through official channels, because documentation through official channels was the only tool available to her. He had them spread across his desk, and he was looking at them with the expression of a man who had received a gift he had not expected and was now deciding how to respond to it. You flagged infiltration markers on days 2, 3, and 4, he said, progressively with increasing specificity. They were there to flag. First-year ICU nurses don't typically flag peripheral infiltration at that level of subtlety. My father described peripheral line failure in field conditions, Isolde said. He was a corpsman. He was specific about the visual markers because in the field, you don't always have a monitor to confirm what you're looking at. You develop the observation without the equipment. Holloway looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly required by the information. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. 30 minutes later, Isolde Vane was added to the press appearance detail. IV monitoring only. Peripheral position, not to be introduced, not to be included in any photography. A functional presence in the room whose role was technical and whose visibility was, as far as the official event schedule was concerned, 0. She accepted this without visible reaction. She walked back to the break room, sat down at the corner table with the clear sight line to the door, and placed both hands flat on the table surface. She breathed through her nose, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. A calibration breath. The kind of breath that belongs to the moment before entering a controlled environment where the cost of a mistake is not academic. She sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the table and the fluorescent light above her maintaining its standard hum. Then she opened her field journal to the page with the hand diagram and looked at it one more time. 2 fingers up, second finger folded, thumb crossed underneath. She closed the journal she had one day. She had spent 11 years preparing for a moment she had never expected to use, taught by a man who had believed in preparing for things you prayed would never be necessary. He had been specific about that. The signal is not a plan, he had told her. It is a last resort. You use it when the chain of trust is broken and the person who needs help cannot speak. You use it when you are certain. She was certain. She went back to work. That evening in the locker room, she opened her locker and took out the metal tin and held it in both hands for a long time without opening it. The room was empty around her. The standard hospital sounds, the distant monitoring equipment, the ventilation system, the particular acoustic quality of a building that never fully sleeps, came through the walls at their usual frequencies. She opened the tin, she took out the laminated card and read it one more time. Then she placed it back inside, along with the paracord and the photograph. She closed the tin. She replaced it in the locker. She looked for a moment at the face-down photograph against the back wall. She reached in and touched the lower edge of it, very lightly with 2 fingers. She closed the locker. Tomorrow the press appearance would happen. Tomorrow she would be in that room with a prepared statement and a staged presentation and cameras arranged at angles selected for their flattery. And none of it would be any concern of hers. The 4th line was her concern, and the hand that she had drawn in her journal, and the man in room 12 who she had not yet confirmed would understand it, and the fact that he would have to. That was the part she had not written anywhere, because some things are only real once they have already happened, and this one had to remain a question until it wasn't. She picked up her thermos and her journal and her watch, and she walked out of the locker room and down the corridor and out into the evening air. Then where the city was doing what cities did at this hour, and somewhere overhead, the low cloud cover moved slowly above the hospital in the dark. If you have ever watched someone do a job, they were never supposed to be small enough to hold, and known, without being able to explain why, that you were watching the wrong container for the thing inside it, leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Every city, every time zone, every person who has ever seen something the room around them missed. Subscribe if this story is pulling you forward, because tomorrow she walks into that room, and in less than 1 second, everything in that building is going to change. The night before the press appearance, the ICU ward went quiet in the way that hospitals go quiet after 11 p.m. Not silent, never silent. Oh, but reduced to its essential sounds. The monitoring equipment in its steady rhythms. The ventilation system cycling through its intervals. The particular acoustic texture of a building that has been built to sustain life continuously and therefore never fully powers down, holding its breath at a lower register rather than releasing it. Isolde drew secondary observation on room 12 that night. She had not requested it. The assignment had appeared on the evening rotation board at 9:47 p.m. under Wren's handwriting, which was compact and slope-consistent and never wasted a letter. The entry was brief. Room 12, secondary observation, 2330 to 200, Vane. No explanation. No additional instruction beyond the standard secondary protocol she had been given on her first day. Vitals, log, leave. She changed into a fresh set of scrubs at 23:15. They tucked her field journal into her left breast pocket, checked her watch, and went to the nursing station to pull the relevant cart before the corridor filled with the ambient quietness of a ward, preparing itself for its deepest hours. At 23:40, she reached room 12 and pressed her badge to the reader. The reader accepted it. The light shifted from red to green, and the door released, which told her that Holloway had updated her clearance level sometime in the past 12 hours, which was information she filed without visible reaction. She pushed the door open and entered. He was awake. She registered it in the first half-second. The monitoring equipment showed a heart rate that was 12 beats per minute above resting range, which was consistent with wakefulness rather than the light sleep range the sedation protocol should have produced. His hands rested at his sides rather than across his chest, which was not the position of a man in recovery, but the position of a man managing his own readiness. His eyes were closed, but the quality of the stillness in the room was not the stillness of sleep. Admiral Aldrich Marsh was 61 years old, and the hospital bed held him the way a frame holds a painting that was made for a larger wall. He was not a large man in the obvious sense, not outsized, not physically exaggerated, but he occupied the space of the room differently than the room had been designed to be occupied. The hospital gown sat on him with the specific wrongness of a uniform on a body that had been trained for an entirely different kind of clothing, and the monitoring equipment attached to him seemed, in some difficult-to-articulate way, like a misapplication of the correct tools. The room had been modified. She cataloged it as she moved toward the vital signs monitor. The standard hospital wall art had been removed, leaving bare walls with the faint rectangular outlines of frames. The overhead lighting was dimmed below the standard clinical setting. The monitoring equipment had been rearranged so that the displays faced the bed rather than the observation window, which meant the patient had been able to read his own data since his arrival, which meant whoever had rearranged the room knew what the patient would want, and had acted on that knowledge rather than standard protocol. She checked the IV line first. The drip rate registered on the pump, and she looked at the number the way she always looked at numbers, not reading them so much as weighing them. And then she looked at the bag, and then she ran her eyes along the line from the bag to the insertion site, at his right antecubital, checking the tape and the skin beneath it. The slight puffiness at the insertion margin had not resolved. She made a notation in her field journal, block print, 3 words, and a measurement. She reached for the vital signs cuff. "You keep looking at the rate." His voice came out of the stillness without warning, low and level, the kind of voice that is not quiet by nature, but by current choice. She absorbed the fact of his wakefulness without physical reaction. No startled movement, no catch of breath, which was itself a response, and he noticed it. She completed attaching the cuff before she answered. "It's logged at 42 milliliters per hour," she said. "The protocol range for your indicated condition is 28 to 34. The cuff inflated. The monitor registered its reading. She noted it in her journal. "Who told you my indicated condition?" "No one." She did not look up immediately. "The differential from the visible symptoms and the non-redacted section of your chart suggests a post-surgical inflammatory management case. The standard infusion protocol for that presentation has an upper boundary. You are currently above it." A silence. "Who told you the non-redacted section of my chart?" "The system allows secondary observation staff access to the vitals history and the current medication, log header. I read what I was permitted to read." She removed the cuff and made her notation. When she finally looked at him directly, She found him already looking at her with the focused attention of someone who has been doing a different kind of assessment than the conversation suggested. "Who did you train under?" he said. It was not the question she had expected, and the quality of it landed differently than a standard clinical inquiry. It carried the specific weight of a question asked by someone who already suspects the answer and is testing the accuracy of the suspicion, rather than seeking information from scratch. "I completed my nursing degree at—" "That's not what I asked." The monitoring equipment continued its rhythm. She capped her pen. "My father was a corpsman," she said. "I grew up around medical practice in field contexts, and I absorbed his observational methods before I had formal training." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "His unit," he said. "That's not something I discuss," she said. Another silence, and in the silence something shifted in the quality of the air between them. Not hostility. Something else? The specific atmosphere of two people who are each aware that the other knows more than they are saying, and who are, for separate reasons, choosing not to accelerate the disclosure. She moved to the door. At the threshold she stopped. The hesitation was brief and visible only to someone watching for it, and Marsh was watching for it, and he saw it. She half turned, not quite facing him. "I would recommend requesting a second physician review of your current management protocol," she said. "Yeah, if you have the standing to make that request through a channel that doesn't pass through this hospital's standard administration process." She left without waiting for his response. In the corridor, she stood with her back against the closed door of room 12 for 4 seconds. She felt the door's surface against her shoulder blades, and she breathed through her nose, and she let the 4 seconds pass, and then she walked back to the nursing station without looking behind her. Inside room 12, Marsh reached beneath the mattress edge with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body was not performing at its full capacity, and who had made peace with working within that limitation rather than against it. He retrieved a folded slip of paper from the gap between the mattress and the bed frame and opened it. He read what was written on it. Then he folded it again and held it in his hand and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man in the final stage of a calculation. He had been waiting for something since he arrived at Crest Haven. He had not known exactly what form it would take. He was beginning to understand. The morning of the press appearance, the hospital's energy changed in the way institutional energy changes when something with real external weight is about to make contact with it. Facility staff arrived 30 minutes earlier than their standard time. The ICU reception orchids were replaced with a fresh arrangement before 6 a.m. The corridor outside the ICU wing was cleaned with a thoroughness that exceeded the standard rotation by a measurable margin, and the overall effect was of a space that had been asked to perform rather than simply function. Lavinia Price moved through it at 7 a.m. in pale gray, with her pearls, with the composure of someone executing the final stages of a plan that had been months in construction. She had reviewed the appearance schedule 3 times in the past 2 days. The journalist clearances were confirmed. The photography positions had been walked personally the previous afternoon. The framing language she had prepared for the opening remarks was calibrated to 3 purposes simultaneously. It honored the Admiral's service, it positioned Crest Haven as the institution capable of his recovery, and it introduced the kind of language around federal partnerships and institutional excellence that certain members of the journalist pool would recognize as relevant to a story they had been expecting to write for some time. She had spent 9 years building the reputation that this moment would leverage. She had managed difficult moments before, funding shortfalls, a departmental malpractice complaint 3 years ago that had been resolved quietly and expensively, the ordinary turbulence of running a large institution. She managed these things with the same tools she used for everything, narrative control. The story you told about what had happened was, in most cases, more powerful than what had actually happened, provided you told it first and told it with enough consistency that it became the available reference. The imaging result from the Admiral's intake scan was in a pending queue where it would remain until the federal review window closed and the funding relationship was secured, at which point it could be addressed through the standard specialist consultation process without the urgency that would attach to it now if it were active. The dosage management had been adjusted to ensure the Admiral was adequately comfortable during the appearance without being so sedated that his presentation would undercut the recovery narrative. These were management decisions. They were reasonable within the framework of institutional priorities that she had spent nearly a decade establishing. She did not think of them as concealment. She thought of them as sequencing. Isolde arrived at the ICU wing at 7:15, 20 minutes before her shift start, which was 14 minutes later than her standard arrival time, which meant she had slept less than she would typically allow herself, and had used the recovered time for something else. She went directly to the locker room. She changed into clean scrubs. She opened her locker and touched the metal tin, the same single pass of her thumb across the lid, and then she closed the locker without taking anything out of it. She went to the nursing station and pulled the secondary observation chart for room 12 from the previous night, and added her final notation from the 2 o'clock close of the observation window. She wrote it in block print, as always, specific and without interpretation, the raw observational data from which conclusions could be drawn by whoever read it. Then she went to prepare her IV kit. At 9:30 a.m., the anteroom outside room 12 held 5 journalists, 2 photography rigs positioned at angles that had been calculated rather than approximated, a 3-person hospital communications team, Lavinia Price at the center and along the far wall, beside a medication trolley, a second-year ICU nurse with an IV kit and an analog field watch and slightly oversized scrubs, who had not been introduced to anyone and whose name was not on the distributed event schedule. Lavinia stood before the journalist cluster and spoke in the warm, calibrated register of someone who had been doing this long enough to make prepared language sound considered. She described Cresthaven's commitment to the men and women who served. She described the Admiral's recovery as a testament to the institution's capabilities. She framed the morning as an opportunity not for spectacle, but for acknowledgement. The quiet, serious acknowledgement that those who carried the weight of service deserved from the institutions that served them in return. And as the journalists listened with the professional attention of people who would decide later which parts of this were quotable, the door to room 12 opened. He came out in a hospital transport chair, not a wheelchair, a distinction someone had made deliberately, with a Cresthaven-branded blanket across his lap, and his hair combed in a way that had required another person's assistance. He wore the hospital gown with the same fundamental incompatibility he had worn it in the dark of his room the night before. He had been prepared for the cameras the way a location is prepared for a shoot. The essential truth of the thing was still present, but it had been dressed for a different purpose. His eyes moved through the room in the first 3 seconds. Isolde watched him do it, and she watched his gaze take the room apart into its components. The journalists, their positions, and the directions they were facing, the photography rigs and their likely frame lines, the staff, their roles and their relationship to the space, the door he had come through, and the door at the far end of the corridor, and the distance between them. She watched his eyes reach Lavinia and register her position and then move on, and she watched his eyes reach the far wall where the medication trolley was and where she was standing beside it, and she watched them stop, half a beat, not long enough for anyone else in the room to notice. His expression did not change. Lavinia stepped forward and her voice resumed its prepared cadence, moving now into the substance of the appearance. The journalists oriented toward her and the Admiral. The photographers began their work. The communications team held the perimeter of the rope line and kept the energy of the room at the correct pressure. Isolde moved to the Admiral's chair. She had one function in this room, and she performed it. She crouched beside the chair and accessed the antecubital site, checking the IV line with the careful, thorough attention she brought to every IV line she had touched in 11 weeks, which was the same careful and thorough attention she had been bringing to things long before, 11 weeks ago, in a context she had never explained to anyone in this building. She checked the tape. She checked the insertion margin, pressing lightly along the perimeter of the site to assess the tissue response. The slight puffiness she had documented the night before was stable but present. She adjusted the tape securing the line, smoothing it down with 2 fingers, and her hands were steady and precise and gave no indication of anything beyond the task they were performing. Lavinia's voice continued. Isolde's right hand rested flat against the Admiral's forearm for 1 second. She raised it, 2 fingers upward, the second finger folded across the first at the proximate knuckle, the thumb crossed underneath and pressed against the palm, held for the duration of a single breath, less than a full second, and then her hand returned to the IV line, and she completed her check and reached for her kit. The cameras did not capture it. The journalists were watching Lavinia. The communications team was watching the journalists. Lavinia was watching her own prepared language land in the room. No one in that anteroom saw what Isolde Vane had just done, except the man in the chair. She felt the change before she finished standing. It moved through him the way a current moves when a circuit completes. Not on the surface, below it, a fundamental shift in the nature of the thing. She did not look at his face while it was happening. She straightened, tucked her kit under her arm, and stepped back toward the medication trolley with the unhurried movement of a peripheral medical presence completing a peripheral function. When she was back at the trolley, she looked at him. His spine had aligned. His hands, which had been resting on the chair arms with the loose compliance of a man being moved through an event, they had shifted. Both thumbs folded inward in the specific gesture of acknowledgement and receipt that she had been taught to recognize. His face was unchanged, which was the most significant thing about it, because the control required to maintain that absence of expression in the moment after receiving that signal was not a passive or easy control. It was an act. He looked at her, not the assessment look from the night before, a full, direct, completed look. The look of a man who has received a transmission and confirmed its source and is now operating on the information it contained. She did not look at him again. Lavinia was still speaking. The appearance concluded 20 minutes later without deviation from its prepared script. The journalists were escorted through the atrium by the communications team. The photography rigs were broken down with practiced efficiency. The corridor outside room 12 returned to the managed calm that had been the ward's mode since the Admiral's arrival. Lavinia spoke briefly with the lead journalist from the television pool, confirming the embargo timing for the evening broadcast segment. She spoke with her communications director about the print distribution schedule. She reviewed the photography selections on a tablet and approved 2 of the 6 options with a gesture of efficient finality. She did not acknowledge Isolde, who was at the medication trolley 6 feet from her, replacing items in her IV kit with the methodical precision of someone who intends to leave a space exactly as they found it. Lavinia left the wing. The corridor was quiet. Inside room 12, and Peregrine Falk stood at the foot of the bed and watched the Admiral sit upright in the transport chair with the specific quality of uprightness that had nothing to do with the chair's design or the hospital gown's permission. The blanket was gone from his lap. He had removed it himself the moment the door closed. "The nurse on IV detail," Marsh said. "Vane." Falk's phone was in his hand before the sentence completed. "First rotation, 11 weeks in, second-year equivalent placement, IICU. Her father." The phone screen shifted as Falk entered the search parameters. "Callum Vane, Corpsman, Special Operations Support Designation, 3 classified embeds between 2001 and 2009. Died in service." Falk looked up from the phone. "Classified posting. No exact circumstances, not in the available record." The room was quiet for long enough that the monitoring equipment filled the silence with its steady rhythm. "He taught her the field override signal," Marsh said. Falk did not respond immediately. He looked at the Admiral with the particular expression of a man absorbing the full implication of a sentence rather than just its surface. "She used it," Falk said, "during the appearance, while the CEO was talking." Falk looked at the door through which Isolde had left that morning. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone revising a picture they had been building for 2 weeks. "Get me Donahoe," Marsh said. "Private channel, full audit of my medical record from intake. Everything that has been entered, modified, reclassified, or removed. Every authorization code. Oh, every timestamp." He paused. 2 hours, Perry." Falk moved. He did not ask a second question because he understood, as he had understood for the 11 years he had worked beside this man, that the instruction was complete and the reasoning behind it would either confirm itself or it would not, and either way, the information would be more useful than the alternative. Marsh watched him go. Then he settled back into the chair with the careful management of a body that was not operating at its full capacity. And he looked at the bare wall opposite him, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. What Falk's channel returned in 1 hour and 53 minutes was not a medical record in the ordinary sense. It was a document that had begun as a medical record and had been worked on by several pairs of hands over 11 days. And some of those hands authorized and some of them not. And the result was a text that told 2 stories simultaneously. The story it presented on its surface, and the story that became visible when you read it against what it was supposed to contain. Falk placed the tablet on the surface beside Marsh and stepped back. Marsh read. He read with the focused attention of someone for whom documents are not administrative objects, but evidence, reading not just the content, but the structure, the gaps, the places where language had been chosen to describe something without committing to the description. He read the dosage entries on days 2, 4, and 6, and he looked at the authorization fields, and he looked at the timestamps, and he held the credential number from the authorization field against his memory of the attending rotation schedule that Falk had pulled for him on his third day. The credential did not belong to the attending on duty on any of those 3 dates. He read the imaging section. The post-operative CT conducted at intake, the radiologist's notation flagging a result as requiring follow-up consultation. He found the follow-up entry, a reclassification to indeterminate status, dated 2 days after the original flag, entered under an administrative access code rather than a physician code. He read the administrative access section, which was the section that most patients would never think to examine and which contained, in its dry procedural language, the clearest account of what had been decided and by whom. The reclassification had been entered from a device registered to the hospital's executive administration system, not the attending physician's system, not the radiology department's system, the executive administration system. He looked at the document for a long moment after finishing it. The tendons at his jaw worked in their steady, controlled way, and the quality of the silence in the room was the quality of a man in the final moments before a decision moves from consideration to execution. "How much of this did she document before we had it?" he said. Falk had been waiting for the question. He picked up the tablet and navigated to the nursing observation log. He found the entries filed under vein, eye, and he placed the tablet back on the surface with the relevant section visible. Marsh looked at it. The first entry was dated day 3. Block-printed text, compressed and precise. The kind of notation that contains maximum information in minimum space. The kind of notational habit that did not come from nursing school. Day 3. Dosage variance, undocumented. 622. Below it, day 3 again. Imaging protocol gap noted in active chart record. Status unknown. Day 4. Visitor log discrepancy. 2300 to 200 window. Badge logged, name unattached. Day 5. Medication timing pattern inconsistent with documented presentation. Secondary indicator, swelling margin, right antecubital, progressive over 72 hours. He read each entry once. He did not read them twice. "She was watching on day 3, he said. "Before the access request," Falk said. "Nice before Holloway was involved. She documented what she could see through secondary observation protocol, and she put it into the official record, through official channels. It was the only tool she had." Marsh looked at the entry list for a long moment. He looked at the date stamps. He looked at the specific language, not medical language, not the standard nursing documentation language, but the compressed indicator-based notation of someone who had been taught to record observations in conditions where speed and precision both mattered, where the record might be read under circumstances very different from those in which it was written. "She knew before we did," he said. The room held the sentence. Falk looked at the observation log with an expression that was not quite what most people would have called an expression. It was the particular arrangement of a face that a person produces when they are revising something significant in their understanding of a situation and doing it in real time. "How do you want to proceed?" he said. Marsh reached for the tablet. He navigated to a contact in an address book that was not linked to any commercial service, and he composed a message in 4 lines and sent it on an encrypted channel to a recipient whose designation in the contact list was a 6-digit number rather than a name. "I want Federal Medical Review officers notified," he said. "Full evidentiary package from the audit, timeline from intake to today, every authorization code, every access timestamp, and every reclassification entry." He set the tablet down. "And I want the board chair notified directly, bypassing the CEO's office, tonight." "That will trigger an immediate investigation," Falk said. "Yes," Marsh said. "It will." He said it with the level, resolved finality of a man who has been waiting 11 days for the moment when the correct action became unambiguous, and for whom that moment has now arrived. Outside room 12, the ICU corridor continued its late afternoon patterns. The monitoring equipment maintained its rhythms. The nursing staff completed their rotations. The orchids in the reception area held their arrangements under the calibrated light. At 4:17 p.m., Wren Aldgate found Isolde in the break room. Isolde was at the corner table with her field journal open, and her pen making its block-printed entries at the end of a shift that had produced its standard documentation. She looked up when Wren entered, and she registered the particular quality of Wren's movement, not the standard end-of-shift energy, but something more contained, more specific. And she closed the journal. "The Admiral's aide has been making inquiries about you," Wren said. She was not accusatory. She was the tone of someone who had received information they were still processing. Not through nursing administration, through the board chair's office. Isolde looked at her. "The board chair received a communication this afternoon, through a channel I have no access to and apparently no context for," Wren continued. "Within 2 hours of that communication, I was notified that Federal Medical Review officers will be arriving at Cresthaven tomorrow morning at 8. She paused. "Whatever is happening involves this ward, and this ward involves you, and I need to understand what I'm managing." Isolde was quiet for a moment. "I checked his IV line," she said. "I did my job." "His aide is asking about your father," Wren said. The break room's fluorescent light maintained its hum. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and released a brief sound of monitoring equipment, and then closed again. Isolde looked at the table surface. She looked at her pen, which was capped, which was lying parallel to the edge of the journal, which was the way she always placed it. "My father taught me something when I was 12 years old," she said. He said you use it once, and you use it when you are completely certain. He said the reason it exists is because sometimes the chain of trust breaks, and the person who needs help cannot say so." She looked up at Wren. "I was certain." Wren stood in the break room doorway with the expression of a person revising the architecture of a situation they had believed they understood. "What exactly did you do in that room today?" Wren said. "I checked his IV line," Isolde said again. But the way she said it the second time was different from the first time. Not louder, not harder, not with any additional emphasis that could be described as deliberate, but different. The way a sentence is different when it means more than its words contain. Wren looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the table, and at the journal, and at the worn analog watch on Isolde's left wrist, and at the medical tape on the watch band, at the point where the leather had worn through from long use. She looked like a woman understanding, for the first time, which direction the light in a room was actually coming from. She left without another word. Isolde sat in the empty break room. She opened her field journal to the page with the hand diagram. She looked at it for a long time. 2 fingers extended, second finger folded, thumb crossed underneath. Then she turned to a fresh page and she wrote 1 line. She wrote it in block print with a timestamp. She capped her pen. She closed the journal. In room 12, at that same moment, Marsh was reading the acknowledgement response from Donahoe's channel. The Federal Review notification had been received and confirmed. All officers would be in the building at 8 o'clock. He held the tablet and he looked at the bare wall opposite his bed. And he thought about a corpsman named Callum Vane, whom he had met once in Kandahar in 2005, in the particular context that produced the kind of meeting you do not forget. And he thought about a kitchen table somewhere, and a 12-year-old girl learning the shape of a hand signal that her father had never expected her to need. He thought about a medication cart with an unsecured lower drawer, about a field journal with block-printed entries beginning on day 3, about a woman who had found the only tool available to her, and had used it at the only moment it could work, in a room full of cameras and press representatives, and an institution's entire public-facing narrative, all while standing close enough to be dismissed as a peripheral presence. She had known before he did. She had been watching since day 3. She had been the only person in this building who was doing what a person in this building was supposed to do. The monitoring equipment continued its rhythm. The bare wall held his gaze. He reached for the notepad on the bedside surface, and he wrote 3 lines in his own handwriting, which was a deliberate, non-compressed script, each letter formed with the care of a man who signs documents that carry weight. He folded the paper once and wrote a name on its outside face and set it on the surface beside the tablet. The name on the folded paper was Isolde Vane. Falk would deliver it in the morning, after the review officers arrived, after the board meeting, after whatever came next had begun to take the shape it was going to take. But he wrote it tonight, in the quiet of a room from which everything unnecessary had been removed, because some things needed to be written in the moment of their understanding, rather than in the convenience of their aftermath. The hospital moved around him in its overnight rhythms. Tomorrow, the federal review officers would arrive. Tomorrow, the audit would be presented. Tomorrow, Lavinia Price would walk into a room she had built on the assumption that she was the most powerful person in it, and she would discover that the most powerful action taken in her hospital in the past 11 days had been performed by a nurse who was not on the official event schedule while she was in the middle of her own prepared remarks, and it had lasted less than 1 second. Tonight, in the break room at the corner table, Isolde Vane sat with her field journal closed under her hands and her watch keeping its standard time on her wrist, and she breathed through her nose in the 4-count interval, and the fluorescent light held its frequency, and the hospital moved in its overnight patterns all around her, and she was, in that moment, neither more nor less than what she had always been. The only question was whether tomorrow would finally ask her to prove it in a room where the answer could not be contained. If this story is landing somewhere in you, somewhere you recognize, leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you the longest. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it, because tomorrow Marsh walks into that boardroom. The audit goes on the table, and the woman who ran this hospital is about to understand that the 11-week rookie she never looked at twice had already ended her. The boardroom notification arrived at Lavinia Price's office at 7:52 in the morning. Her assistant brought it on paper rather than through the standard digital routing system, which was itself a communication. Paper meant it had come through the board chair's office directly, bypassing the administrative pipeline that Lavinia had spent 9 years shaping into an instrument of her own institutional authority. She was standing at her glass wall when the assistant entered, watching the atrium below fill with the morning's first foot traffic, the staff arriving in their overlapping rotations, the building becoming itself again after its overnight reduction. She read the notification once. A patient care review meeting convened at 1400 in the primary boardroom. Attendance required from the CEO's office. Requested by the patient in room 12 through his military aide, routed through the board chair. The notification carried the board chair's signature and a second signature below it that she did not immediately recognize, and then did. And the recognition moved through her chest with a specific quality that she had not felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly, but the thing that precedes fear in people who have managed institutions long enough to understand what certain signatures mean about the nature of the meeting they are being invited to attend. She set the notification on her desk. She straightened her jacket. If she went to her morning appointments and conducted them with the same calibrated efficiency she brought to every morning, because the worst thing a person in her position could do in the hours before a difficult meeting was to allow the anticipation of it to contaminate the visible record of the day. She reviewed a departmental budget proposal. She approved a staff recognition nomination from the cardiac unit. She responded to 2 emails from the Federal Liaison Office with the measured, forward-leaning language she had been using with that office for 8 months. At 13:45, she gathered her notes, which she had prepared and then set aside because she understood by then that the notes were for a meeting she had imagined, rather than the meeting she was about to attend. And she walked to the primary boardroom. She pushed the door open. As Admiral Aldrich Marsh was standing at the far end of the conference table, not in the transport chair, not in the hospital gown. He was wearing his own clothes, dark and civilian, and brought by Falk at some point in the morning that she had not been informed about. And he was standing with the quality of uprightness that belongs to a body which has made a decision to stop accommodating an environment and to simply be itself within it. The hospital had been managing his presentation for 11 days. He had stopped allowing that this morning. Peregrine Falk stood to his right with a printed document in his hand. 2 men in dark suits occupied chairs on one side of the table without introduction or identifier of any kind. Elliot, the board chair, sat at the table's perpendicular side with the expression of a man who had understood the shape of the afternoon before it began and had spent the intervening hours making peace with what his role in it required him to do. Lavinia crossed to the table and sat. She had managed difficult rooms before. She had sat across from regulatory investigators and departmental complainants and board members in states of genuine distress, and she had managed each of those rooms from the same position, the position of the person who understood the institution better than anyone else present, and who therefore carried the authority of institutional knowledge as a form of structural advantage. She had walked into difficult rooms and made them easier by being in them, which was a specific skill she had developed over a long career and which had never failed her. This room was different. She understood it was different before she was fully seated. The difference was not in the faces or the documents or the formal positioning of the people around the table. It was in the quality of the authority already present, which was not institutional in the way that her authority was institutional. It did not come from a title or a budget or a governance structure. It came from something that had been built in a different kind of environment entirely, over a different kind of time. And it occupied the room the way a load-bearing wall occupies a building, not visibly, but as the reason nothing falls. "Admiral," she said, "I wasn't aware you were feeling well enough to—" "Sit down, Ms. Price." She had already sat. The instruction arrived a fraction after the action, and the gap between them contained the full meaning of the morning, which was that the sequence of events in this room was no longer going to be shaped by her choices. She had arranged the sequence of events in this institution for 9 years. For the duration of this meeting, she was not the architect of the sequence. She was inside it. Marsh placed the audit summary on the table. He placed it without speaking, which was the choice of a man who understood that the document was more effective without accompaniment. He let it sit between them for a moment, one full moment, the duration of a breath, and then he opened it to the first tabbed section. "Page 1, he said. "The dosage record, days 2, 4, and 6. He did not raise his voice. He did not require it. As no attending authorization, no patient consent documentation. The authorization credential does not correspond to the attending rotation on any of those dates." Lavinia looked at the document. She did not touch it. Page 4. "The post-operative imaging result flagged by radiology at intake. The follow-up consultation it required." He turned to the tab. "The reclassification to indeterminate status, entered 2 days after the original flag." He looked at her. "Under an executive administrative access code, not a physician code." The monitoring equipment in the building continued its background existence, muffled through the boardroom walls, the building doing what it did regardless of what was being decided inside this room. The patient's comfort was the primary consideration throughout the management. "The patient is in this room." The sentence was not loud. It was not hard. It carried the specific weight of a sentence that does not need to be either, because it contains a fact whose implications are sufficient without amplification. Lavinia was quiet. One of the suited men opened a briefcase and placed a second document on the table beside the audit summary. A Federal Medical Review notification, already filed, carrying a timestamp from the previous evening and a case number that meant the process had moved beyond the stage at which institutional responses could redirect it. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the case number. She understood the timeline. The audit had been completed. The notification had been filed. And the case number had been assigned before she had received this morning's meeting notification, which meant this meeting was not the beginning of a process. It was a stage within a process that had already begun without her. She had spent 11 days managing the sequence of events around this patient. She had believed herself to be operating from a position of informational advantage. She knew the institution, she knew the channels, she knew where the levers were. What she had not accounted for was a different chain of command, one that ran parallel to every channel she controlled and intersected with none of them, one that could be activated by a single wordless gesture from a person she had never looked at directly. "The oversight channel through which this review was initiated," Marsh said, "has existed since 1987. It was created for a specific circumstance, a senior officer in a medical environment who has reason to believe their care is being managed for purposes other than their own recovery, and who cannot communicate that belief through standard channels because those channels pass through the institution responsible for the problem." He looked at her steadily. "The channel bypasses hospital administration entirely. It cannot be intercepted at the institutional level. It routes directly to Federal Medical Review." Lavinia's hands were on the table. She looked at the federal notification. "What activated it?" she said. The question was not quite the question she had intended to ask. She had intended something more controlled, something that would frame her engagement with the information as the engagement of a person managing a misunderstanding rather than a person receiving an outcome. But what came out was the direct question, the one beneath the managed language, the one whose answer she had been working toward since she had read the morning's notification. Marsh looked at her across the width of the conference table. "A nurse," he said. 11 weeks into her first rotation. She noticed a dosage anomaly on day 3 and documented it through every official channel available to her, which produced no action because those channels were routed through your administrative system. He paused. And then she used the one tool she had left, a signal her father taught her at a kitchen table when she was 12 years old. And her father was a corpsman embedded with special operations units. He taught it to her as a safeguard, for use when the chain of trust between a patient and the people responsible for their care has been broken. The boardroom was quiet. She raised her hand for less than 1 second, Marsh said, during your press appearance, while you were speaking. The silence that followed was the kind that a room produces when it has received something irreversible. Not the silence of shock, which is brief and disorienting. The deeper silence of comprehension, which settles. Lavinia looked at the table surface. She thought about the press appearance, the prepared remarks, the journalists in their cleared positions, the photography rigs at their calculated angles. The nurse at the medication trolley along the far wall, who had not been on the distributed schedule, and who had not been introduced, and who had been, for the duration of the event, exactly as visible as Lavinia had designed her to be, which was not visible at all. She thought about what she had been saying at the moment the signal was given. She could not recall the specific sentence. She had delivered versions of it so many times that individual performances had merged into a single representative instance. She had been building a narrative while, 6 feet away, a woman had activated a federal chain of command, using a gesture her deceased father had spent years hoping she would never need. "I thought I was protecting the institution," she said. The sentence came out with the specific quality of a true thing, which it was. It was the truest thing she had said in the boardroom. She had not been indifferent to the Admiral's welfare. She had been executing a prioritization, the institution's continuity as the frame within which individual cases were managed, the same framework she had applied to every difficult decision in 9 years of leadership. She had simply miscalculated, at a fundamental level, the nature of the patient she had included in that framework. "I know," Marsh said. He said it without contempt and without absolution. He said it as a factual acknowledgement, the recognition of a true thing that did not change the other true things on the table. Elliot cleared his throat. "Lavinia," he said quietly, "the board will be placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of the federal review. We'll need your access credentials before you leave the building today." Lavinia looked at the architectural rendering on the boardroom's side wall, a small frame print she had placed there herself, a secondary copy of the rendering from her office, the expansion wing with its nameplate. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone doing a very specific kind of accounting. Then she straightened her jacket, which was already straight, and she picked up her notes from the table, and she stood. At the door she stopped. She did not turn back. "The imaging result," she said. "The flag scan, is he going to be all right?" A pause. "The specialist review is being scheduled today," Falk said, from his position beside the Admiral. "The fragment is addressable." She nodded once, to the door rather than the room, and she left. The Federal Review officers had arrived at 8 o'clock as notified, and they were the kind of thorough that institutions dread because it is the thoroughness of people who have no stake in the outcome except accuracy. They established themselves in a conference room on the administrative floor, and they worked through the digital access logs with the compressed, methodical attention of people for whom documentation is not a burden but a medium, the material from which the true account of events is eventually reconstructed. The security footage confirmed the administrative access entries at 11:14 p.m. on day 3. The timestamp matched, to the minute, the visitor log gap Isolde had documented in her official nursing observation record on the same night. The reclassification access code traced without ambiguity to a tablet registered to Lavinia's executive account. The dosage authorization overrides traced to the same account through a different entry point in the administrative system, which meant that 2 separate decisions on 2 separate days had been made by the same hand working through the same unauthorized channel. The picture that assembled itself from these elements was not complicated. It was the picture of an institution that had prioritized its own narrative continuity over its patients' right to complete and accurate medical management, executed through the specific channels that the institution's CEO controlled. all in the specific window between the Admiral's arrival and the press appearance that would have closed the federal funding leverage opportunity once it had produced its desired result. It was not the picture of malice. It was the picture of institutional reasoning at its most self-enclosed, operating within a logic so familiar to the person applying it that the harm it produced had become invisible. 3 board members reviewed the materials over the course of the afternoon and arrived in separate conversations that were not coordinated but reached identical conclusions at the decision to separate themselves from Lavinia's management framework and its associated decisions. They communicated this to Elliot by 4 p.m., in language that was careful and institutional, and carried beneath its careful language the specific relief of people who have been waiting for someone to establish the fact that the ground has shifted. The nursing staff was not officially informed of any of it. They understood from the quality of the administrative silence, which was a different quality from ordinary administrative silence, and from the absence of Lavinia Price from the building after 3 p.m., and from the particular way that Elliot moved through the ICU corridor at 4:30, with 2 people from the board, not quickly and not with the energy of a crisis, but with the energy of a situation being walked through rather than run from. In the ICU ward, the afternoon proceeded with the normalcy of a ward that has been managed by competent nurses through institutional turbulence before and will be managed through it again, because the work of the ward does not pause for the decisions being made in boardrooms about the people responsible for its direction. Wren ran the shift with the same compressed efficiency she brought to every shift, allocating her attention across the ward with the experience of someone who has developed over many years an accurate internal map of where the pressure is and where it isn't. She checked in with each of her nurses at the intervals that experience had taught her were the correct intervals. She checked in with Isolde at 5 p.m. Isolde was completing her final round documentation at the nursing station, and her field journal open beside her standard chart, the block-printed entries accumulating in their standard way. She looked up when Wren approached, and she registered the particular quality of Wren's expression, which was not the expression of a person delivering news, but the expression of a person who has finished processing news and has arrived on the other side of it at something that required less management than she had expected. The board chair wants to know if you're available to meet with the Admiral tomorrow morning before his specialist consultation, Wren said. Isolde looked at her. The request came through Falk, Wren continued, and it came through the board chair rather than through administration, which I have now stopped being surprised by. She paused. The language used was, the Admiral requests the opportunity to speak with Nurse Vane at her convenience, not at the hospital's convenience, hers. Isolde closed her field journal. Yes, she said. I'm available. Wren nodded. She began to turn away, and then she stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at Isolde with the full, direct attention of someone who has decided to say a thing, rather than continue to manage the impulse to say it. I told you to be careful, Wren said. On day 5, I told you not to make noise on this one. You did, Isolde said. You were right and I was wrong, Wren said. I want you to know I understand that. She said it with the specific simplicity of a person who has decided that the accurate thing and the easy thing are not compatible in this instance, and who has chosen accuracy. She held Isolde's gaze for a moment, and then went back to the station. Isolde looked at the nursing station wall. She looked at the morning assignment board, with its rotating columns of rooms and names and functions. She looked at the place on the board, where room 12 had been listed since her 3rd day with its restricted notation and its absence of patient-identifying information. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to finish her documentation. The morning of the specialist consultation, Isolde arrived at her standard time and performed her standard routine. The locker room was empty at 5:31 a.m. The 11 minutes passed in the way they always passed, in the particular silence of a space she had built for herself, inside the institution's schedule. She changed. She sat on the bench. She opened her field journal. The entries from the previous 11 days filled most of the current section. She reviewed them from the beginning, day 1 through day 11, the accumulated record of what she had seen and what she had done with it. She read them the way she had written them, methodically, without sentiment, but with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to a thing that has been consequential. She reached the final entry, day 11, the single line she had written after her conversation with Wren in the break room, after the meeting she had not attended, but whose outcome had moved through the ward by the end of the afternoon. The entry read, "Signal confirmed, received." She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the journal. She opened her locker. She touched the metal tin, the thumb across the lid, and the gesture so ingrained that it had become less a ritual than a reflex, the body's way of maintaining continuity with the things it has decided matter. She reached past it, and she took out the face-down photograph from the back of the locker wall. She held it in both hands, and she looked at the back of it. The pencil inscription had faded to the point where it was barely legible, but she had read it enough times that legibility was not the point. The letters and the initials were present in her memory. With the clarity of a thing that has been looked at so many times, it has been absorbed into the person rather than simply stored for when the chain breaks. She turned the photograph over. She looked at her father's face. He was crouching beside his field medical kit in the way she remembered from the photograph her mother had kept on the bookshelf when she was growing up, the way she had studied it after he was gone, the way she had memorized it, the way children memorize the faces of people they are no longer going to be given new images of. He was squinting slightly against the light. He was not performing anything. He was simply present, caught between two moments by the camera, in the middle of his work, in the middle of his life. She looked at him for a long time. The locker room held its standard morning silence around her. She thought about a kitchen table. She thought about the specific quality of his hands when he was teaching her something, the way he used both hands to demonstrate, patient and precise. The left holding the form while the right adjusted the angle, never telling her she had it wrong, but repositioning until she had it right. She thought about the particular quality of his voice when he explained the signal, not with solemnity, but with the matter-of-fact specificity he brought to everything medical, as if the emotional weight of the information was understood between them and did not require underlining. She thought about the fact that he had died before she had used it, that she had carried it for 14 years in the category of things that were important and untested, and probably unnecessary, and that she had walked into a press appearance 11 days ago and used it in a room full of cameras and journalists, and an institution's entire curated narrative, and it had worked, and he had never known she would need it. She placed the photograph against the back wall of the locker, face forward. She reached into the metal tin and took out the smaller photograph that lived there. Older, more worn, the same military-issue paper, the edges white from handling. It showed the same man in a different context, standing rather than crouching, with two other men in field gear whose faces she knew from the stories he had told her, in a landscape that was not the same landscape as the first photograph, but was the same quality of landscape, the same light, the same quality of presence. She placed it beside the first. Two photographs, side by side, face forward, against the back wall of a locker in a hospital where something had been changed. She looked at both of them together, the same blood, different moments, the same hands in both images, visible, doing the work they had been trained to do. She took the commendation from her jacket pocket. She had been carrying it since Marsh had given it to her the previous day, folded inside her jacket against her chest, unread in the moments between receiving it and opening it, and then read in a stairwell at the end of her shift, with her back against the wall and the late afternoon light coming through the access door's window. She had read it twice. She had refolded it and placed it back in her jacket. She opened the metal tin now. She placed the commendation inside it, folded once, tucked flat beside the laminated card and the paracord knot. She closed the tin. She replaced it in the locker, in its position above the photographs. She looked at the arrangement for a moment. Then she went to work. And room 12 held a different quality of space when she entered at 9 o'clock. The monitoring equipment was still present, but the room had been further modified in the night. The hospital gown replaced with the Admiral's own clothes. The bed adjusted to a sitting configuration rather than the reclined recovery position. The blanket removed. The objects that had accumulated on the bedside surface over 11 days had been reduced to 3. A glass of water, the tablet Falk used for communications, and a folded piece of paper. Marsh looked at her when she entered, not with the assessment quality of their first meetings, not with the focused recognition of the night she had given him the signal, with the quality of a person who has arrived at the point in a situation where the assessment is complete and what remains is simply the acknowledgement of what the assessment found. "Sit down," he said. It was the first time he had offered her a seat. She sat in the chair that Falk had placed beside the bed at some point in the morning, and she set her IV kit on the floor and folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him. "Your father embedded with Task Unit 7, he said. 2003 through 2006, 3 rotations, Kandahar, Helmand, a third location that is not in any record I have access to, and which I therefore will not name." Her hands in her lap remained folded. She was very still. "I met him once," Marsh said. 2005, Kandahar, where we were 3 days out from a forward position, and 4 members of the team had taken fire during an extraction. Your father managed all 4 in a field setting, with equipment that was not sufficient for one. He paused. "I have worked alongside a great many corpsmen in my career. He was the finest field medic I encountered in over 2 decades of operational service." The monitoring equipment continued its rhythm. Isolda's jaw moved once, the single visible indication of something working through the controlled surface of her composure. Her eyes held their steadiness. "He taught you the override signal," Marsh said. "He said," she began. She stopped. She gathered the sentence from the place it had been living since 2009, and she brought it out with the care that things require when they have been held a long time in a specific place. As he said, if you are ever in a room with someone who cannot speak freely, and the people responsible for their care are not doing what they were trusted to do, and you are certain, use this. So, they know someone is watching. She paused. He said the most important thing you can do for a patient who has lost control of their environment is make sure they know they are not alone in it. The room held the sentence. "How long had you been watching?" Marsh said. "Day 3. He nodded. The nod of a man confirming something he had already known and finding the confirmation to be exactly what he expected. "He raised you right," he said. She breathed through her nose, 4 counts, the calibration breath, and her jaw worked again. And her eyes did the thing that eyes do when a person decides not to let them do what they are preparing to do. And she held it. She held it with the same composure with which she had held everything for 11 weeks and for 14 years before that. The composure her father had modeled, not by teaching it, but by living it in front of her until it had become hers. "He never knew I used it," she said. Marsh looked at her. "He prepared you to use it," he said. That was the knowing. The distance between those two things, being prepared and witnessing, moved through her in a way that was visible only in the finest details. The slight increase in the rate of her breathing immediately controlled, the way her folded hands adjusted their position, the fingers opening slightly and then returning. A person who had been watching her carefully for 11 weeks would have recognized these as the largest emotional expressions she had produced in that time. He reached for the folded piece of paper on the bedside surface. "A formal commendation," he said. "Confidential. It will go into a file with a small number of readers and a permanent record." He held it out to her. "I want you to know it exists. I want you to understand what it says." She looked at him. "I already have it," she said. He looked at her. She reached into her jacket and withdrew the commendation he had sent with Falk. She held it up briefly so he could see it, and then returned it to her jacket. A silence. Then something happened in his face that had not happened in any of their previous encounters, which had been characterized by controlled attention and assessed distance and the specific quality of a person managing the expression of what they were thinking. Then what happened was small and was the opposite of controlled. A brief, involuntary relaxation of the muscles around his eyes, a softening so slight that it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for exactly this. The expression of a man who has, in a brief and unexpected moment, been genuinely surprised by something and found the surprise to be not a complication, but a relief. "Good," he said. One word, the specific weight of a word that contains an entire sentence's worth of meaning, carried in its single syllable without the sentence needing to be spoken. She stood. She picked up her IV kit. At the door, she stopped. "My father left me the signal," she said. "He left me the laminated card that explains the protocol. He left me a photograph and a knot tied in a specific way and a tin that I have opened every morning for 6 years without being able to explain why." She turned, not fully, speaking toward the door more than the room. "I used to think it was a form of grief, the keeping of it." She paused. "I understand now that it was a form of preparation." Marsh said nothing. She left. In the corridor, she walked with the heel-to-toe precision of someone who has stopped managing their pace and is simply moving at the pace that comes naturally, which was, it turned out, the same pace as always, but with a different quality underneath it. The quality of someone who has stopped carrying something at a slight angle to avoid it being seen, and has begun carrying it directly, which is less effort, which feels different in the body. She passed the nursing station where Wren was reviewing the morning board. Wren looked up. "Primary care on 12 is yours through discharge," she said. "Holloway's notation is in the system." Isolde looked at the board. Room 12 at the top, her name beside it, the primary care designation that she had not held on this patient for the 11 days during which she had been the most attentive observer of his condition in the building. "Thank you," she said. Wren turned back to the board. "You were thorough," she said. "That's the notation." Isolde went to begin her rounds. She moved through the ward with her kit and her journal and her worn analog watch, and the ward moved around her in its ordinary morning patterns. The monitoring equipment in its rhythms and the staff in their rotations and the patients in their various stages of needing things. She worked through rooms 7 through 11, and she worked through room 12, and she worked with the same compressed efficiency and technical precision she had brought to the ward since her first day, which was the same precision she had always had, which had always been waiting inside the institution's frame for the institution to have the correct relationship to it. She passed the hand sanitizer dispenser on her way back from the east corridor, the new one, properly mounted and correctly filled, installed after she had identified the problem on her first day without being asked. She did not look at it. Yet she had noted its replacement 4 days ago, and had moved it from the category of things requiring attention to the category of things that were handled. The orchids in the ICU reception had been changed that morning. She passed them without stopping. At the end of her shift, she completed her documentation with the same block-printed entries in her field journal and the same careful cross-referencing with the official chart system that she had maintained since day one. She reviewed her entries for the day, made one correction to a measurement notation, and closed the journal. She sat for a moment at the nursing station. The ward moved in its late afternoon rhythms around her, the monitoring equipment, the ventilation. The particular acoustic texture of the building in the hours before the evening shift brought its new energy. When she picked up her journal and her thermos and she went to the locker room, she sat on the bench and she opened her locker and she looked at the 2 photographs, face forward, propped against the back wall where the one had been face down for 6 years. She looked at them for a long time without moving. The afternoon light came through the high locker room window at its standard angle, the same angle it had come through every afternoon since her first day. The same fluorescent supplement overhead, maintaining the same frequency. Everything in the room was exactly as it had always been, except the photographs. She reached into the locker and picked up the metal tin. She held it in both hands in the way she had held it every morning, the weight of it familiar and specific, the small combination lock resting against her left palm. As she opened it, she looked at the 3 items inside, the laminated card, the paracord knot, the commendation folded flat against the card. She lifted the laminated card and read the line she had read hundreds of times. "For when the chain breaks, use this. The person who needs it will know." She set it back in the tin. She closed the tin and replaced it in the locker. She looked at the photographs one more time. Her father, crouching beside his kit, squinting into the light, present between 2 moments, in the middle of his work. And beside him, in the older photograph, standing in a different landscape, the same quality of presence, the same hands visible, doing the work. She thought about a boardroom, about an audit summary placed on a table without accompaniment, about a woman who had run an institution for 9 years and who had, in the end, prioritized the institution over the patient, and about how the counter to that prioritization had been a signal given by a corpsman's daughter who had been assigned a secondary observation and had been thorough. She thought about less than 1 second. She thought about what her father had known when he folded her hands into the correct position at a kitchen table and told her, with the matter-of-fact care he brought to all medical instruction, that this gesture was for the moment when the chain was broken and someone needed to know they were not alone in it. He had known that she would carry it. He had known that carrying it was not grief but preparation, and that preparation of this kind does not expire. It waits. She closed the locker. She picked up her field journal and her thermos, and she left the locker room and walked down the corridor and through the ICU wing and out through the main entrance into the evening air. The city was doing what it did at this hour, its lights coming on in the early dark, its sounds layered in the way that large living places layer their sounds. She stood for a moment at the entrance with the thermos in her left hand and let the air come in through her nose. Somewhere in the cloud cover above the city, a helicopter moved through, the sound of its rotors cutting briefly through the low cloud. She did not grip anything. She stood with her hands at her sides, the thermos loose in her left hand, and she listened to the sound as it moved through the gray above her and then passed beyond it. And she breathed, and she looked at the city below, and when she did not track the cloud line where the sound had gone. She went home. Behind her, in room 12, the bare walls held the quiet of a space that had been built for a specific purpose and had served it and would now serve a different one. And the monitoring equipment continued its rhythms in the way that things continue when the decisions around them have been made, and the work of the living is simply to continue. In the locker room, the two photographs remained face forward against the back wall of an open locker, the light through the high window passing across them, at its afternoon angle, catching the edge of the tin above them, the small scratch symbol on its base present in the light for a moment, and then passing out of it. If you have ever carried something for a very long time, not as a burden, not as a trophy, but as a readiness, and the moment finally came when you understood what it had been for, leave a comment below and tell us what that felt like. Every city, every time zone, every person who has ever prepared for a moment they hoped would never come and was ready when it did. This channel exists for those stories, and if this one found you, subscribe and stay, because there are more of them, and every one of them belongs to someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved it more than anyone else in the room.
What stayed with me after this story was not the boardroom. It was not the moment the federal officers walked through the door, and it was not the moment Lavinia Price picked up her notes from the table and left. Those moments felt like conclusions. What stayed with me was something much quieter than any of that. It was the 11 days before any of it happened. 11 days of a young woman writing in a journal that nobody knew she kept, logging observations that nobody asked her to make, watching something wrong unfold in a restricted room she had no authority to question, and doing it anyway through the only channels available to her because she had decided that the correct thing and the available thing were not going to stop her from doing the necessary thing. The moment I could not let go of was the drawer. The unlocked drawer on day 3 because she could have closed it. She could have relocked it, walked back to her cart, and finished her shift, and nobody would have ever known the difference. She had no obligation to look. She had no protection if she did. She was 11 weeks in, peripheral by design, invisible by institutional arrangement. And she opened it anyway, not dramatically, not with a plan fully formed. She just looked at what was in front of her because that was the kind of person she was before the story gave her a reason to be. That is what this story is really about, I think, not the signal, not the military chain of command or the Federal Review. It is about what a person does when they have no leverage and no audience and no guarantee that anything they do will matter. That is the truest test of character, not the moment when someone is watching, the moment when no one is. There are people watching this right now who have been in rooms where something was wrong and they saw it and nobody else did or nobody else said anything, and they had to decide quietly and alone what kind of person they were going to be in that moment. You do not need a uniform or a clearance level or a title to understand that feeling. Being the only person in a room who notices something and knowing that noticing it comes with a cost is one of the most quietly human experiences there is. I keep thinking about one question. Not whether she was brave, because I think bravery is too simple a word for what she did. What I keep thinking about is this. How many rooms right now have someone like her in them, watching, documenting, waiting for one tool that will actually work? And how many of those people are being looked at twice? If this story brought something up for you, something you recognized, something you lived, I would genuinely like to read it in the comments. And if you want to stay for the next story, we will be here. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story pulled you in, subscribe now, because what comes next is the moment the Admiral walks into that boardroom and the CEO realizes the signal was never just a gesture. It was a chain of command she never knew existed.